This is the free audiobook of Elemental Power. If you haven't heard the previous chapters, you'll find the link to the playlist in the description below. Book 1, Shattered. Chapter 28, Anvin and the Elements. We burst out of the tiny cottage on Marlowe's heels. Peta was in the middle of the yard, holding Anvin captive. She held him tightly in front of her, a knife to his throat. I sighed with relief and squeezed Glenn's hand as we ran together toward them. As we ground to a halt, I noticed relief on Anvin's face as well. "Not so well met, Glen Ellenbill, Prince of the Eastern Lands," the grayish, sullen wind sprite said. His Adam's apple bobbed, and the knife nicked him. Blood welled up in stark contrast to his skin, looking black in the eerie light. "Anvin, why?" Glen asked. Boreas approached, with Aura in tow. Anvin turned his head slightly and nodded in recognition. He turned back to Glen. "Will you hear me?" "I will." "Make it official," Anvin said. "You stand accused of attempted murder against your prince. How do you answer?" "Guilty. Will you hear more?" "I will." Peta lessened the pressure on the knife ever so slightly, allowing him to swallow without being cut. Marlowe stood beside her, short sword in hand, ready to skewer him if he tried to escape. Anvin didn't move an inch. He spoke clearly and stood like a statue. "I was seduced by lying spirits. The shadows lured me. Before I knew it, they were in my heart, and I was bound to them. I was sent to watch over you in the castle of Rune. They bound me in chains and abused me." Glen nodded, but didn't speak. I stood there, taking it all in, but keeping close watch of my periphery. I was waiting for the warlord. "They sent me here to kill you. I was captured by this fire sprite. Will you hear more?" Glen nodded. To my surprise, Anvin turned to me. "It was I who carried you that day when you had given up hope and lain down to die. I pitied you and carried you from the Central Lands to the path where he found you. I knew you for who you were. That's why I was near the spring that day. I was one of many posted sentries, traitor sprites and owls, to inform the fairies of your arrival. The owls reported you, but I saw you were a woman, and also what had been done to you. I never expected that." He turned back to Glen. "I am a traitor. I know the penalty." Glen swallowed hard. Peta let a sideways smile creep onto her face. By that look alone, I knew the penalty was death. "Yes," Glen said. "Then I ask you to perform it, now, before he gets here." "Is there no other way?" Glen asked, sounding as if he found the burden of judge and jury too much to bear. "If you do not kill me now, I will become one of them, a fairy, and I will do you harm. Please, I beg of you, kill me." Glen nodded, lifted his hands, and said, "I find you guilty." Then he lowered his hands heavily to his sides and looked at the ground. "Peta?" Peta slid the knife across the throat of the willing wind sprite. I heard the tendons pop and felt the drops of hot blood splatter on my face as the artery was severed. His life poured from him, and she dropped him into the spreading puddle of it, cleaning her knife immediately on his tunic. I put a hand on Glen's back in support. His head hung in sorrow, but his back remained straight. He believed he did the right thing. So did I. I'd been a slave of the warlord, and no matter what the enemy, I couldn't wish that fate upon anyone. I wiped the traitor's blood off my face with my sleeve. "Thank you," Glen whispered to Peta. "My pleasure," she said, sheathing her knife. Ambius came up to us and stared down at the cooling body of the wind sprite. We all watched as he drew up his long arms, the sleeves billowing in the wind, and Anvin faded into air, swirling up to the sky. "You will make a merciful king one day, my lad," Ambius said. Glen just stared off into the ominous setting sun, his jaw set against his inevitable future. "We have contacted the Creator. The first part of your quest is done. Now we must speak of the next part." "What about the warlord?" I asked. "He is still some way off. We have a few minutes to talk." I followed him over to where Candlewick had been set up. Once inside, he raised his hands over his head and spread them out and down, drawing a large circle. A golden box appeared in front of him. It was intricately decorated with leaves, vines, and flowers. I'd never seen anything more beautiful. "Princess, open the chest." I stretched out my shaking fingers to touch the clasp. I'd barely laid my hand on it when it opened, slowly. Something inside was glowing, pulsing with a force greater than light, perhaps pure energy. When the lid was all the way open, I could see 3 small burlap sacks tied with twine and an empty place where another should be. I looked up at Ambius, puzzled. He frowned down at the chest. "The hag told you of the black quartz?" "Yes." "It was stolen from the northern lands 10 ages ago. We were each given 1 stone by the Creator to use in such a day as is coming. Never did we think anyone would dare steal from a watcher. But someone did. The black quartz went missing. The trolls who guarded it waged war on the eastern lands, blaming them. You will know of this war?" "Yes," I said, a little softer. I looked at Glenn. His face was purposely blank. "When we discovered the theft, the others and I sealed our elements within this trunk, and I have kept it hidden safely until now. Open them." I pulled the twine slip knots from the little bags. Inside each was a stone roughly the size of a softball. Their brilliance dazzled me. I could hardly look away to ask Ambius what they were. "These stones are gems from heaven. That is an emerald, the keeper of the element of wind. Look closely at it." I did, and noticed a tiny whirlwind held within the stone. The firelight in the tent made the rainbow sparkles dance on every surface. It was priceless and beautiful. I laid it carefully back in its sack and tied the twine. Next, I held a sapphire bluer and clearer than any I'd ever seen. Within it, waves lapped calmly against the sides as the shine danced in the room. I returned it to the case. The last one was a chalcedony, red as blood and full of flame. It was hot to the touch, and that shocked me so much I nearly dropped it. The glow it cast was warm, but somehow deadly, a firestone. When all the elements were once again contained within the golden trunk, Ambius sent them back into the ether to remain hidden. I stood up and followed the watcher out of the tent with the others. The sun was nearly down now. A chill came over me. I could hear something coming this way. Rock ambled over to us. "We are ready," he said. "Good," Ambius replied. "Peta, Marlowe, and Boreas, you set up a perimeter. We have the east covered. You take the other points. Glenn and Alana, you stay here. When he comes, we will be ready for him. Prepare yourselves for battle." I swallowed hard. I'd done this before, but never with advance warning. The enemy had always leapt out of the darkness and forced me to call upon the elements instinctively. My heart was thumping wildly, about to explode. "Oh, look, here comes Zarana," Ambius said, pointing. A large procession was coming toward us from the southwest. It looked like a sea of red flowing along the green grass of the hills. There were at least 36 people in the procession. We watched as they approached, and I breathed more easily, seeing friends instead of fairies. Zarana and her daughters were in the lead, all on horseback. So, there were horses in this world. They were majestic beasts at that, like Frisians, black with long manes that flowed in the breeze. The other mystics followed behind her, and they led more utilitarian horses with carts full of luggage. It was an exodus. When they halted in front of us, Zarana slid nimbly from the saddle and came to stand in front of Ambius. "Well met, Ambius. Well met, Madame Zarana. We have come to seek shelter in your domain. The central lands are boiling with evil, and we are in danger. The warlord has found a strong ally in another heir. Will you grant us sanctuary?" "Of course. You are all most welcome to live here," bowing to them all. "Thank you, kind watcher." She turned to me. "You have done well. Soon you will have access to the ancient knowledge of the mystics. You have our thanks." "Thank me when it's all over. They're not given up easily." She smiled, her face wrinkling as she did. "As you wish," she said, and turned back to her people to instruct them in setting up camp. Aura stood with Glenn and me as we watched the new arrivals make themselves at home. The men of their group were sharpening their weapons, preparing for the battle they must surely know is coming. The other elementals were on patrol. I could see Peta a few hundred yards away, her sparking hair glowing as the darkness crept up on us. I sat in the grass, wanting to preserve what little energy I had. "Aura, would you run into the tent and get me some strength and some storm, please?" I asked. "And some for me as well," Glenn added. "Of course, Your Highness," she said, without a trace of sarcasm. Glenn grimaced, and I laughed, grasping firmly to what levity I could to keep from trembling. She returned, and we drank together in silence, watchful. There seemed to be no immediate threat, so I leaned into Glenn in the growing darkness. "If we make it through this, will you take me to your childhood home? It would be nice to see it. Maybe we could stay there, at least until the final day when we have to be at the Dead Spring again." "When we make it through, I will make all the arrangements. I will return home for your sake." I smiled at his certainty. Aura made a tiny squeak as Boreas raised his arm. They were here. We stood, watching the deeper darkness rolling in from the west. The sun had fully set, and the land was swathed in deep blue, but the creeping black of the enemy made the natural darkness seem bright by comparison. There were thousands of them, fairies, descending upon us over the grassy hills from the shadows of the great forest. Glenn had his bow in hand with an arrow ready to fly. He waited, stepping in front of me. I peered around him and saw Peta and Marlowe coming from either side of Boreas to stand together and fight. The men, and quite a few women from the Mystics' camp, joined them with weapons drawn. I noticed that they all had the band around their arms, the band that to me meant friend. The elementals changed form then. Peta was a woman of flame. I couldn't see her eyes, but I didn't need to. I knew the hunger for combat that burned there. I stole a glance to my left, back toward the Watchers, wondering when they were going to show up. They were there, ready. Rock and Ambius walked side by side toward the oncoming hordes. The ground rumbled beneath our feet. Worm was there too, tunneling beneath the battleground. Poor Silver was stuck in the well, unable to move on land. She watched, though, thin blue arms stretched toward the field like sniper rifles. I reached for Aura's hand, and she clasped onto me, a child frightened by the storm. Peta made the first strike. She charged into the oncoming ranks like a flaming banshee, screaming insult and invitation mixed in a high-pitched battle cry. Marlowe ran behind her, becoming a wave of water that smashed into the ranks of fairies. Boreas sent tornadoes into the midst of the swarm, flinging them up and out of the way. Ambius and Rock each had weapons of their own. Ambius sent beams of blue light into the seething front lines and decimated several dozen. Rock sat on his hind legs and sent red beams from his front legs. Worm popped up in the middle of the oncoming hordes with a great rumble of earth and shot golden light from the top of his blind head. Silver, from her well, sent white light into the ranks, picking off the wounded fairies before they could do more damage. Boreas was using blessed arrows now, back in bodily form. They struck their targets, one after another, and beams of blue light shot from the center of the black, shadowy bodies. Suddenly, a fairy flew out of the darkness and slashed at Boreas's right arm. He fell. Aura let out a scream of anguish beside me and was gone, rushing on the wind to her love. She swirled over him. He didn't move. With strength she shouldn't possess, she carried him on the breeze toward the town of Wooddale, away from the battle. We had lost a soldier. A wave of nausea brought me to my knees suddenly. Red eyes appeared in front of me, between me and Glenn. I gasped. Glenn turned, pointing his arrow at the eyes, but also at my face. I held up a hand, trying to make him see that he'd kill me as well. He lowered his weapon grudgingly, a fraction of an inch. I felt it then, the scar on my neck opening yet again, blood streaming down my throat and onto the grass. On my knees, in front of the malevolent eyes of my umpteen great-grandfather, I raised my face defiantly, gathering strength from the fear and hatred seething in my chest. He spoke out of the ether, with the voice like grinding boulders, and his eyes smiled, demonic glee plainly displayed. Well, well, Alana, we meet again. The story continues in Book 2, A King's Burden. If you enjoyed this chapter, please give it a like and/or a comment. And if you think someone else might enjoy the story, please share with them the first chapter. If you subscribe and turn the notification bell on, you'll be the first to know when the new chapter is released.